All right, we are live. So this is Dr. Tara, and I want to welcome everyone to Dr. Tara Tuesdays. As always, I appreciate you all for joining me, for just giving me a moment of your evening. I am so excited about our conversation this evening because of its importance and relevance to so many people. The reason actually why I decided to have this conversation around anxiety is because of just the posts I've been seeing on social media with so many people talking about experiencing anxiety, being impacted by anxiety either through themselves, their own lives, or a loved one. And so I felt it was important enough that I wanted to bring on an expert. And so to the Dr. Tara community, I want to welcome Dr. Abena, who is here, who is here with us today. And so we are going to have this conversation because I think it's so important and so needed. And so, Dr. Abena, I want to welcome and introduce you to the Dr. Tara community, and thank you for joining me this evening for this conversation. And I just want to jump right into it. Okay. So, when you think about anxiety and how it impacts people of color especially, why do you think it's important to use your platform to bring awareness and address the stigma around it?
So when I think about the type of work that I do with people and what I really love to do with people, I love to help people to realize their greatness. Mm-hmm. And so many times anxiety gets in the way of that without people really realizing it. So people end up with a lot of self-doubt. Mm-hmm. They end up not taking risks that they could probably easily succeed in, many times because of anxiety and self-doubt, and just not being able to be at that point where you can get past the worry. Mm-hmm. and get past the what ifs and try to really realize their greatness. So it's a really important part of what I do is to help people to understand when what they're experiencing is actually anxiety so they can move past it and get to the place where they really want to be in their lives.
I love what you said about connecting anxiety to self-doubt. One of the things that I saw just in one of the posts where someone shared that we were going to be talking is tune in because some of us may be suffering from it or experiencing anxiety and you may not even know it. Like my self-doubt can become so ingrained in who I am. It becomes a part of just my normal conversations with myself. I'm not even realizing I'm doing it. How do you help people make that connection between self-doubt and feelings of anxiety?
Yeah. Sometimes it really just takes talking to someone and sorting out those feelings because it's true. I mean, risks are risks because they're risky. We can be in a situation where we want to try something new, or we want to do something different in our lives, but we're concerned about what the consequences could be if we don't succeed the way we want to succeed. Sometimes it really does take talking through what's stopping you from moving forward to figure out whether or not it's something that is a true legitimate risk that can maybe be worked through, or is it really just your own fear of your own success in some ways?
Shamia says, how do we know when something is anxiety versus something else?
I think sometimes it's hard to tell, for sure. It depends on what that something else might be. Sometimes that something else could be something else physiological, which is a valid point because anxiety often mimics other physiological conditions. A lot of times when we're experiencing anxiety, we can experience different cardiovascular changes. We can experience different gastrointestinal changes. There can be tension in our body, headaches, problems with sleeping. So many times it really does take some introspection and trying to be really honest about what's going on in your life, trying to really think about the connections that are happening in your life. And sometimes it takes someone to put those things out.
I think too, for me, like acknowledging this beautiful brain-body connection that we have. So you talked about issues with our stomach, headaches, tension. And so a lot of times when we are anxious, our body gives us those signals first. And I think one of the things that people experience, and I'll put myself in here too, a lot of times we learn over time to ignore those triggers. Like if you are listening, give me a thumbs up if you learn to ignore your signals. Like I feel a pit in my stomach, I'm starting to sweat, and I'm going through anyway. And so the beautiful thing about our bodies is that it's going to get our attention. And so if I have to keep giving you the or intensifying these symptoms until you actually start to pay attention or do something about it, then people see it manifest as a panic attack, or I'm just shutting down completely. You know, and so I think one of the things that I just want to emphasize that you said is getting back in tune with our body. Every emotion that we have, there's usually a physiological or biological or physical sensation that I feel it, and allowing ourselves to honor that too, because one of the things that I often hear is in my conversations with people, sometimes people feel like anxiety just kind of sneaks up on them. You know, I was having a great day and then all of a sudden, and yes, we know that can happen, but a lot of times it's because I've built up these trigger points. And over time. And so in your work, how do we get ahead of that? How do I start to pay attention to that sooner rather than on the tail end after I've had a panic attack, or after, you know, I've had everything scheduled and I just shut down and I cancel everything?
Sometimes you just need to do that.
Yes.
That's what happens, and that's what it takes.
Put that on the t-shirt. Sometimes you need to cancel everything.
You gotta do that. You gotta do that. You gotta give yourself a mental health break and honor that. Sometimes we learn how to do it early and take those little mental health breaks along the way. And sometimes it takes a crisis or some point in time where we just can't do anything else but stop. But it's important to take those breaks. I think one thing that you mentioned about learning to ignore the signs that your body are giving you, or learning to ignore that inner voice. Sometimes we're taught to do that very early on. And so it is a learned behavior that we learn even as children, to not pay attention to or to discount the types of messages that our body are giving us, or even to listen to our bodies and pay attention to our bodies and listen to our inner voices. And so sometimes unintentionally, our parents or the people who are taking care of us don't really teach us to pay attention to those voices, and instead might just tell you, okay, well, whatever, you're still going to do this, or you're still going to have to do that, and you're going to have to push through.
You're fine. Nothing's wrong with you. Stop doing that. Yeah. I mean, yes, I want to just stop and say, connect with people. Yes, like how many of us have been taught those messages? Oh, you're fine. You'll be fine. Get over it. You're not scared. Yeah.
And doing that without giving people the opportunity or really encouraging them to process exactly what's going on at that point in time, that's leading to that feeling. And so we learn very early to ignore those signs and not pay attention to connections of what's happening in our minds and happening in our bodies. And so it's a whole as adults to learn that, to unlearn that pattern of pushing through and not paying attention and not taking time to tune in to what's happening with you internally. And it really does take a very conscious effort as adults to unlearn some of those patterns and do what we know is better for ourselves now that we're adults and we can make those decisions for ourselves. And then what can probably be one of the most important steps is to also model that for your children. So as you do that for yourself, as you take care of yourself, you're also modeling that for your children. And you can even tell your children sometimes when you're taking a break, like, you know, mommy needs a break. Daddy needs a break sometimes. And it makes sense because, you know, sometimes when we're going through things, it's not a bad thing. It really is a sign of strength and a sign of wisdom when you know well enough when you've reached that point. And go ahead.
I was going to add to that. When you talk about, when I said, you know, and I just shut everything down, oftentimes what I get on the tail end of that, or what I receive from people is, and now I feel guilty about it. or there's a level of shame. And I want to connect what you said about how we have learned, how it's been instilled in us, you know, to power through and push through. And so almost as taking breaks are signs of weakness versus being signs of strength. And so what then people have is, I'm anxious and that leads me to shut down. And now I'm feeling guilty. And now I'm anxious about feeling guilty. Right. And so how do we start to connect that shutting down as a sign of strength and as a sign of replenishment versus as a moment of weakness or something to feel then guilty about and apologize for?
It's something that you really have to believe for yourself and validate for yourself. To even simplify that, I can give you an example, a personal example, for someone who could go on a vacation and feel like they're being punished for that. Which is sort of it's a different type of example, but it's the same thing. Like, you deserve a break. And you can't wait for someone to tell you you need a break. And you can't wait for someone to reward you for that, because sometimes other people will try to make you feel bad for saying no to something, for deciding that you may not want to attend a certain event, for deciding that a certain situation makes you feel uncomfortable. But without you understanding how important it is for you, it's going to be hard not to feel guilty, because sometimes people will try to make you feel guilty about it.
And I think too, one of the things that you talked about is that whole mindset. And so I'm going to jump around. I know we talked about some of our questions, but I want to stay on this topic of mindset and retraining, and like you said, unlearning and then relearning ways that we talk to ourselves. And so when we think about how so much of our self-talk is impacted by anxiety, I'm not doing enough, or look at where I am in comparison to someone else, or, you know, I've gotten to where I thought I wanted to be, but I'm not able to stay here because now I'm looking towards something else. How do we begin to change the conversations that we have with ourselves? Like, what are little strategies or skills that I can start to implement when I find myself stuck in those, what if this happens, or what if this happens, or why am I not doing this?
Yeah. So that self-talk happens all the time. And it happens probably more often than people really admit to or understand or even realize, because it becomes like background noise. So one of the things that's really important at some point in time is to be able to pay really close attention to the very small changes in our moods, in our energy levels, and in our attitudes. Sometimes when you're able to do that, you're able to stop yourself, take a couple of steps backwards, and then think about what your self-talk was at that point in time. Because it happens so quickly. It happens automatically. And we tend to develop certain habits, many times bad habits, to have this self-talk just running constantly in the background of our mind. It happens so often, and if we're not paying attention to the changes in our mood, the changes in our attitude, the changes in our energy levels, we don't even realize it's actually happening. So,
go ahead, Abena.
Yeah, so as we get to the point where we're able to really pay attention to those really small changes, I mean, they happen so quickly, but even to say, I was okay a second ago, and now I'm feeling a little bit funky, you know? Or I was okay a second ago, and for some reason I've got an attitude. It requires a lot of self-awareness, but once we get to that point, we're able to backtrack and start thinking about what we were thinking about. Like, what is it that I was saying to myself at that point in time where my mood changed? Or how did I evaluate myself in that quick second when my energy level changed? Or how was it that I was feeling okay about going to this party, and now I just want to put on pajamas and put the covers over my head? Which might be something that you want to do, but sometimes it's really important to take a moment and think about, well, what are the thoughts that were going in my head? What did I tell myself? And what did I say to myself? Yeah.
What Christina's asking, I feel like anxiety often manifests itself in my family members as needing hyper control over meaningless things. And one of the things that I've seen is that anxiety causes us to be reactive instead of proactive, and it can manifest itself. Like she said, I have to feel that sense of control. And can you speak to that?
Yeah. So, often when we feel anxious, we're worried about the worst possible outcome. So we catastrophize. And when we're worried about the worst possible outcome, we feel like we have to control every single aspect of a situation, which can be anxiety provoking within itself. One way to drive yourself a little bit, batty is to feel like you have to control every single aspect of a situation, because it's almost impossible, and it can be very disappointing, and then it can lead to more anxiety. So it sort of makes sense that when you're feeling anxious, you feel like you want to control everything, because you feel as if you don't control everything, then something terrible will happen. So I hope that kind of clarified it. I don't know if there was another question in that comment.
How can someone get rid of that feeling of I have to control not just everything, but almost every person too? Because I've seen that interplay too. Not only do I have to control what's going on in my day-to-day, I also have to control the people that are in my day-to-day. I'm the only one that can handle this, or I'm the only one that can do this. And so then we become Superwoman and Superman and become martyrs and angry at everyone. Because a lot of times that anxiety leads to irritation when people move in the way that we want them to move.
It does. It does. Well, you know what? It comes to a point where we have a choice in life. We have a choice to continue doing things the way we've always been doing them, or to decide to try to do things differently. And sometimes we get to this point in our lives when we realize that the way that we're doing things just doesn't feel good. Like, it might feel like it served a purpose at some point in time. It might have been important at some point in time to have as much control over a situation. But now, at this point in our lives, we realize that it's actually causing us more distress than anything else. If we were to get into the root of that type of problem, sometimes people are in situations where it is absolutely necessary for them to have as much control as possible. Like, there could be like a dangerous situation that they've had to live through, or a risky situation they had to live through, where it was absolutely important and vital to their survival that they had as much control over everyone and everything as possible, as much as possible. And sometimes that type of energy serves us well. It means our survival. It means that we're okay in that moment. But then we come to a point in our lives where we have to make a decision about whether or not that same approach to life is helping us, or is it making things more challenging or more difficult? And that does take self-reflection, and it does take introspection, and it does take taking some time to really listen to your inner voice and take a holistic view of what's happening within your life. And if you get to that point, sometimes we're brave enough to really consider that there might be another way of doing things. There might be a way to possibly not feel like you have to have control over everything, and things will be okay. I've seen it happen the easy way for some people, and I've seen it happen the not so easy way for some people, where they just kind of realize, you know what, it's no way I'm going to control everything. And if I keep trying to do this, I'm going to do more detriment to myself than anything else.
And to people too, right? Because
again,
I said, and to people I love. Because if I'm a controller, right, then what that also implies is that I am the one who knows everything and you don't.
Right.
Like, I'm the perfect one and you are not. And so that can sometimes create alienation or a power struggle between someone that I love, that I'm not, intentionally trying to say that I'm in a power struggle with, but because I have to control everyone, then the flip side of that is that people feel that, and they feel as though they're being controlled.
Right.
And so it impacts different areas of our life.
And some people in our lives are able to speak up and say that. like maybe a spouse or a peer, but then there's some people in your life that might not be able to say that, like your children. And so it manifests in different ways. And so depending on how it manifests, it's important to be open to that conversation. Sometimes it's hard to hear those types of messages coming from your loved ones. But when you love someone and you trust someone, sometimes you do have to kind of look past whatever reservations you have and kind of pay attention to the message that you're getting from the people who love you, who care about you, and who you probably trust. So sometimes that feedback is not comfortable to receive, but oftentimes it's really important to try to listen to it.
I want to go to two comments that Sharice made. And I love the comments that people and the questions that people are asking. One of the things that Sharice says is, how do you prepare yourself when self-talk doesn't work, when medication may not work, for situations that you know have previously caused or currently cause an anxiety attack? How do you stop the attack when you are at a place where you can't immobilize or you can't kind of get yourself together? If I know that this thing brings me anxiety, so her example was driving. If I know that this thing brings me anxiety, and I also know that I still have to do it, how do I begin to prepare and build up my protection around that?
Right. So if you're working with a professional, you with a therapist or a counselor, there are different strategies that you could probably talk to your therapist about. There are different physiological strategies that can be helpful, like learning relaxation techniques. But there's also some cognitive behavioral strategies that might be helpful, and even figuring out ways to be exposed to a situation that causes you anxiety with some sort of response prevention. So being gradually exposed to a situation that causes you anxiety, but also learning ways to cope with the anxiety in a more controlled manner. And so driving, for example, is a tough one because it makes it really hard to function, depending on where you live, if driving makes you really anxious. So that's something that I think would be really important to probably speak with a professional about and try to work on some strategies that will work best for you.
I know that you said like the relaxation techniques, understanding, one of the easiest one of the sometimes easiest places to start with relaxation is the five senses, right? So
Absolutely.
Yeah, what is my favorite thing to see? Can I think about that thing? What are my favorite sounds to hear? Can I play that in my car?
Right.
Who's my favorite person to talk to? Who's the easiest person for me to talk? Can I talk to them while I'm preparing to, go over here? And can we give each other cue words? So like, I love what you said about those relaxation techniques and really building upon them, because a lot of times even just thinking about the event creates anxiety before the event even happens, right? Whether it's a person, whether it's a place, or, any of the nouns in our lives too. Sharice also asked, and then Mark, I'm going to come to your comment. Is anxiety hereditary? Dr. Abena, have you seen?
When we think about how anxiety can be passed down from one generation to the other, sometimes we are physiologically prone to experience anxiety or even to experience other mental health challenges. Even when it comes to PTSD or depression, we can be genetically prone to it. What happens even more is that it's modeled for us. So we can pass down fears and anxieties from our previous generations. They come to us, and then without self-awareness, it's pretty easily passed down to future generations. And this is something that's been really widely studied, especially when it comes to things like post-traumatic stress disorder, excuse me, post-traumatic slave disorder, understanding that situations that we've been taught to fear out of sheer survival, we involuntarily teach our children to fear. Because of course, what do you want for your children?
Right.
For them to survive and for them to also thrive. So it's not something that's horribly intentional that happens. It really is something that happens unintentionally, and really because out of fear, where we want our children well, we want to make sure we keep them from harm, but we can be, without really understanding and knowing, we can be passing down different anxieties to them as well too.
One of the things that how I see that play out just in working with parents is how people have been taught to express emotions, right? So a lot of times we learn, like you said, I've learned how to express anger because of how it was modeled in my home. Either I expressed it the same way, or because of how it was expressed, I expressed it the exact opposite way, or I learned how to express love, or I learned how to get my needs met, or I learned how to voice my opinion about something. And so when you break down, that anxiety and how it impacts relationships, whether it's parenting relationships, partner relationships, or even friendships. Like you said, I may have the best intentions for you. And at a certain time, especially if we're looking at post-traumatic slave syndrome, when me keeping you close and me having control of you was essential for survival, or, even coming into modern times where certain situations can happen where it's scary for us to let children explore, but still a need
for our children to just be children.
Right. Or children, yes, or children should just be children, right? And so how that then impacts their self-talk that they start to give themselves and their sense of self, right? So what I'm saying to myself and how I view myself too. Mark is asking, what happens when the negative self-talk gets too loud or too overwhelming and you cannot stop it and begin to backtrack? What do you do next?
These are some really good questions. So there's a strategy called thought stopping that can be practiced and taught. And it really is, in some ways, you can consider it like changing station on your television. And you might be taught to kind of visualize it in that way, where you realize that there's a thought that's not helpful for you, and you want to immediately stop it. So it's like pushing a button on a remote control. It's important sometimes to have some replacement thoughts and to kind of have those replacement thoughts already prepared and ready. It might feel like overkill initially, but maybe even writing the replacement thoughts down, posting them in places where you would normally see them without you even looking for them, up in the mirror, places like that, because it really is, again, a strategy where you are reteaching yourself or reprogramming yourself. So the same way where you're studying something, you're kind of constantly exposing yourself to it. You want to constantly expose yourself to a replacement thought when the negative thoughts become overwhelming.
Abena, can you give an example of a replacement thought that someone may use?
So let's see, what was Mark saying? He's got self-talk that gets too loud. So a negative self-talk would be, I'm not good enough. And so thinking about ways and reasons where you really are good enough, and coming up with a more affirming thought about being good enough, being worthy, thinking about examples that prove that you're good enough and worthy, and actually turning that negative thought around and making it a more positive thought, a more affirming thought, and spelling it out in a way where you'd be reading it, seeing it, exposed to it on a regular basis.
And I like what you said about thought stopping, right? So I know one of the biggest skills I got from being at Howard was the thought that I don't have to think this, right? Literally, when I recognize that I'm thinking something, even if in that moment that self-talk is so loud to me, and in that moment I'm agreeing that, hey, I'm not worthy or I may not be deserving. Also, at the same time, that there's that and yet for those of you who have been with me, that and yet I'm thinking this, and yet I don't have to. I don't have to think this. I can think something else, right? I can think something else. And so I love what you said about, and then having that replacement thought on standby. What's the easiest thing to think about? What's the easiest thing that brings me joy? And so understanding that we can create some sense of control over this, because anxiety makes us feel so out of control and so out of touch with ourselves. And again, one of the things that Sharice just said, we are living in a society where police anxiety is real. I think we can add that, where social media anxiety is real. And all of these things kind of create this narrative or this story where we just have to keep going and going and going and going and going, and not really having compassion for ourselves. And so when we think about the pressure to keep up, or the pressure that police anxiety brings, how do we start to create a respite for ourselves, or how do we start to create a network for ourselves where we can have and get those releases that are so necessary?
Right. So I'm a huge proponent of self-care. Depending on what environment you're living in, what community you're living in, it's almost impossible to avoid that anxiety of police brutality, of the dangers of being a Black person while driving, a Black person while walking down the street, entering your own home. Those fears are real. Those anxieties are real. And depending on where you are, where you're living, it is a reality that you have to deal with on a regular basis. Because of that, self-care is such a priority. It's a huge priority, and it should really be something that people begin to think about as a routine rather than a luxury. It's not a luxury. It is a requirement. It's a requirement in order to make sure that you understand what your baseline is, when we are so often activated by our daily lives. Without really understanding what your baseline is, it's hard to combat anxiety because you're always at a overactive state. So you don't even know what it feels like to be relaxed. And that's when we get to the point where it feels like anxiety has crept up on us, like you explained before, because there's always this small, gradual increase in tension that we're not able to recognize because we don't know what baseline feels like for us. We don't experience it enough. And so self-care is really important to get to that point where we experience baseline at a regular interval within our lives. It has to be a regular interval within our lives. And when we think about it that way, you realize it really isn't a luxury. It really comes down to being something that's required for you to be able to take care of yourself and to survive and to be in a good place, both mentally and physically and spiritually, to take care of yourself and to take care of your loved ones as well.
Where do people start, Dr. Abena, if they're scared or there's a
Say it again.
Where do people start if they feel scared or there's stigma around acknowledging that I'm experiencing anxiety? You know, what if I don't have a good support system? Where do I start? Or, you know, if people around me are anxious, but where do I start with that?
So even if you feel like you don't have a good support system, and not everyone feels like they're ready to talk to a therapist right away for a couple of different reasons, I think it's really important to realize that you can find resources sometimes in unexpected places. Sometimes it can be in your church. Sometimes it can be in your doctor's office, even having a conversation at your regular checkup, not just about, you know, how your heart is feeling, but also about some of the worries that might be contributing to how you're feeling physiologically. There are resources that might be outside of your circle if you are interested in looking into resources online. So oftentimes, if you are into social media, you can find different sites that have very positive content about mental health, about anxiety, and about maybe changing your perspective on experiencing anxiety. So while you might not have people within your inner circle that you feel comfortable talking to about anxiety, because it doesn't feel normal and it's stigmatized. Oftentimes you can find an online community to give you that inner strength or that courage to begin to acknowledge it within yourself. And once you do that, you might have that inner strength and that courage to seek additional help for yourself.
I want to go back to something you said, and I thought it was so real, and Sharice commented too, that we don't experience baseline enough. So I want to compare that to, for those of us who have children, when they're really loud, it's like, stop all that noise, right? Yeah. And then they get quiet, and it's like, why are they being so quiet? What are they doing? Yeah. Think about anxiety, right? When the anxiety is like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And then when we're calm, it's like, I don't know what to do. I have some free time. I'm calm.
When there's no drama.
When there's no drama.
I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know what to do with myself.
Right? And so when we talk about that baseline, part of the healing is allowing ourselves to receive moments of stillness, of calmness, of peace, right? And so that goes into that self-talk, but so many of us are so used to just doing and doing and doing and doing and doing that when we get a moment to stop, I have no idea how to fill the time. Then I just keep doing some more, right? Until my baseline becomes not self-care, but almost self-preservation because it becomes forced moments of rest, right? Versus I'm doing this as a routine. And part of that shift to get in front of anxiety is, we don't want this to be forced. We want it to become routine.
Become routine. Absolutely.
Yes, we want it to
become like brushing your teeth and doing your laundry. Something small and consistent that you do every day, and then something a little bit bigger that you do intermittently once a week, something like that. And it doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be expensive. It really does have to help you to get to the point where you are somehow reaching your baseline. So especially for anxiety, because there's such a strong connection between the brain and the body when we're talking about anxiety and any type of anxiety disorder, it's those brain-body interventions that tend to be most effective in helping us to practice getting to our baseline. It's those interventions like yoga, like mindfulness, like meditation, which will seem to be really challenging at first. The simple thing of sitting still and sitting in a quiet place can be more challenging than we think sometimes because we're just not used to it and it doesn't feel comfortable. Or immediately when we get into that situation, we're fast asleep.
Yeah, right.
It happens sometimes, and that's always a telltale sign for me that people never have the opportunity to relax. Like we're asking that you find a midpoint where you're not overly activated and you're not asleep. When it's really hard to find that midpoint, then that usually means that you're not having an opportunity to relax. You're either going at 100 or you're going at 0. And the more you get to practice being a place in the middle that's comfortable for you, then the better you get at understanding what baseline means for you, because it's subjective. It's something that's different for everyone.
I want to tie 2 comments together. So the Skin Queens she just finished a live on this, and she doesn't know how to experience stress because life doesn't allow it. And then Clique says, how does society make it conducive or not conducive to find that baseline? And I want to merge those 2 comments together because a lot of times we create our baselines in result to what situation, it's situational, right? So if I don't have a lot on my plate this week, then I can fit in self-care. Or, if I don't have to deal with the police officer this week, then I can do something else. And so how do we become, I want to play with those comments in a challenging way, just a little bit. Make it, how do we, even if life doesn't allow it, how do I still allow it in those moments where it may not be as easily or may not be as conducive as I would want it to be.
Right. It takes practice. And I would say, first of all, be patient with yourself and be willing to start wherever you happen to be. Okay. So none of us are going to be experts at meditating. If you talk to someone who does a lot of meditating and they're honest with you, they'll tell you it's not easy at the very beginning. It's not something that comes naturally to us just because of the nature of what you just said. Like, we're constantly on the go. We're constantly under stress. And that can be life stress, typical life stress, and it can also be societal life stress that really does impact us on a very serious level. And so someone who does a lot of relaxation techniques and meditation, who's honest with you, will let you know that it does not come overnight. And it does take practice. So being willing to be a beginner and not expect that you're going to be perfect at it at the very beginning is very important. And on top of that, the more you practice, the better you'll get at it. So it's much easier to say, I'm going to sit in this quiet yoga studio in a controlled environment with this wonderful incense going on in the background and music and an instructor who's guiding me through this meditation. Now, that's great to do that. And it's much easier to do that than to be in a situation where you are under stress at work or someplace else and to still find some peace. In order to get to that point, though, when you're in a stressful situation or a situation where you don't have as much control and you can still find that peace, you have to start somewhere. And you've got to practice it on a regular basis. And so it really does come with practice to be able to get to the point where on a day-to-day basis throughout life in a stressful, uncontrolled situation, you're still able to find some sort of inner peace.
And I think, too, just to add to your point, Dr. Abena, starting where it's easiest, right? So if it's hard for me in that yoga studio, if I can't even see myself going to yoga, but can I create sanctuary for myself in the car? Like, I know I have gotten some of my best meditations in my car before I come in the house. If I know that my house is like, you know what, it's going to be food here, toys here. Let me gather myself so that experience or a situation that I know can be anxiety provoking, especially if I've already had a rough day or a long day, right? How do I create that peace, even if it's just for 5 minutes, where I'm able to sit still and sit with myself too. Khalid also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to answer that question, but go ahead.
No, so Khalid is saying, is there a spiritual impact to high anxiety or not managing our anxiety, especially to African people or people of color who are just by nature such spiritual people?
Okay, let me answer the first question first about starting small. So you mentioned earlier about starting with your 5 senses. And so the great thing about being someplace like a yoga studio or someplace where you are being taught or led in a meditation or something else that's some other type of mind-body technique, whether that is mindfulness, meditation, yoga, anything. The great thing about that is that you might be able to explore what is relaxing for your 5 senses. Right? You have someone there who's experienced who can help you with that. You can also explore it on your own. So even in your car, in an environment like that, where, like you mentioned before, there might be scents that are relaxing to you. There might be music that's relaxing to you. There might be a drive you can take where the sights are relaxing to you. So in order to really tap into that physiological connection between what you are experiencing physiologically and then mentally, it really is important to sort of explore what's going to be relaxing to you in each of your 5 senses and sort of playing on that and figuring out how you can incorporate that in different environments. So the next question, the spiritual impact. I'm sorry, it went away. So I'm going to try. I'm trying to summarize that. The spiritual impact of high anxiety. So when we think about spirituality, and so we think about things that we can experience that might not necessarily be physiological. That means that we do have to have a very close connection to what's happening inside of us. Mm-hmm. So it's not necessarily what you can touch and what's tangible, but what you know to be real without something that you can prove because of physical proof, right? Mm-hmm. But in order to do that, you've got to have a really close connection to what's happening with yourself. Mm-hmm. And you've got to have that close connection where you have faith in yourself and an understanding about what's happening with yourself. There's no way you can really do that in a hyperactive state. Mm. You can't. Mm-hmm. At all. In a hyperactive state, you're in a state of survival and paying attention to the physical environment in a way where you're doing what you need to do to stay safe in that situation. Mm-hmm. However, when we're able to tap into what's happening with us internally, then we are closer to our own spirituality. Mm-hmm. We are able to listen to our inner voice. We are able to pay attention to our intuition, which is the opposite of being overly hyperactive or being hyper aroused. Mm-hmm. So I hope that answers that question.
And when I'm able to sit still too, I'm able to make decisions from that place versus making decisions. And I just want to tie some of the comments together where I feel like I have to control everything, or right. I feel like I have to have the answer right now, or I feel like I have to continue to show up in places that continue to deplete me, right? So mm-hmm. I'm giving and giving and giving of myself and not having anyone or anything pour back into me. I'm able to make decisions that are based in what is best for me right now, what is best looking at the bigger picture versus being reactive. Anxiety makes me very reactive, right?
And anxiety makes you have no faith as well.
Yes. Oh, yes.
So, yeah. So it makes you have no faith.
Like anxiety makes you have no faith. Please.
No faith.
Put that in the comments, somebody.
No
yes.
Faith at all. Because depending on how you define your own spirituality, I mean, for most people, spirituality is tied into having faith, into having a belief that things will be okay, you will be provided for, and things will work out for the best without you feeling like you have to control every single thing. Yes. And so if you're in an anxious state, there's no way you can be practicing faith.
That's period.
Period. That's it.
Period. The Skinner Queen is saying one of the things that she said, I'll just summarize her comment, like with her working on a dissertation and working 3 jobs, salute to you. I've lived that life. Going back into the 5 senses, intentionally listening to music that pours into me, right? That feeds me. And so, again, like saluting you, like finding that time, even if it's on a commute, wherever I'm going, to do something that pours into me. So yes to that. Doc, I don't know, how do people know when it's time to get help? How do I know, you know what, I've been dealing with this. I don't like the result. I don't like what I'm experiencing. How do I know it's time for me to get help?
Yeah. Sometimes we don't realize it until it starts to impact us in different aspects of our lives. It could be, with our work professionally, it can be in our relationships, and sometimes really extreme ways, it can be impacting us physiologically. So there can be like some physiological consequence to our anxiety and not attending to our mental health. Mm-hmm. So depending on at what point we choose to pay attention, because again, your body does give you signs, and sometimes there are messages that are coming from the people that love you, who care about you, and who you trust. But sometimes it's hard to hear those messages. No mm-hmm. one likes to hear anything that can be critical, but it takes a little bit of humility sometimes to pay attention to the messages that you're getting from people, whether or not it is something that's very direct or indirect. So paying attention to those messages, paying attention to changes in your own energy level, noticing how you interact with people and how you feel around people who you may have felt really comfortable around before. And so the earlier we realize that it's time to get some help, the better. But still, there's no time that's too late. You know, there's no time where you feel like, okay, well, I guess I'm on this on my own. You shouldn't feel that way. But the earlier you're able to seek some help and realize that this is impacting your life in ways that you don't want it to, the better for you.
One of the questions that I always ask people is, if you were to answer the question, am I willing to think about the situation differently? And your answer is yes, right? That's a good indicator that maybe I'm ready to reach out, you know, and or am I at the point where I need to think about this differently? Whatever that situation is or relationship is. I want to go back to a comment that Rosalind Nina said, and it was similar to one of the things that Cherie said, but I want to kind of summarize it. So if I have survived something that was pretty traumatic, how do I start to move forward without having that anxiety creep in? And that'll be our last comment of the evening.
So when we have a traumatic experience that occurs, what's continuing to haunt us are the memories of that experience. It's not that the experience is happening over again, but it feels like it's happening over again because of those memories that we have. And so memories are thoughts. They're very intense thoughts, and it's the intensity of those thoughts and intensity of those memories that can be paralyzing and make us feel as if we cannot experience something again, or we have to avoid a situation again. And sometimes that can feel like survival as well. So, of course, if you've done something like hurt your body or been in a bad accident, who wants to go through that again? Nobody, right? And so, in some ways, that's your brain trying to protect you from being in a dangerous situation again. So, one of the important things is to really give some time to really process those memories, process those thoughts, and examine whether or not they're actually continue to be true and continue to be helpful for you. If it's something that's paralyzing to the point where you can't function anymore because the traumatic memories and the traumatic thoughts are making it hard for you to function, then that's the point where it's really time to take control of those memories, process those memories, and figure out whether or not the way we are remembering what happened in the past, remembering the way we're happening. I got that all mixed up. Remembering what's happening in the past is really helpful for you right now. So it's about changing the way we remember things.
That's beautiful. And again, we have control over that too. I can, and just the relief that can bring, right? And just lowering that anxiety. I can, again, change the way that I remember this event.
Right. And I don't say it in that way to make it seem simple, because it's not.
Right.
It's not simple. It's not easy, but it is possible. Yeah.
It's not simple. It's not easy, but it is possible. Another thing we want to put on a t-shirt. Dr. Abena, as we get ready to wrap up, what are your 3 takeaway points for people experiencing anxiety, and how do we begin the process of getting ahead of it?
Okay. So I would say 3 takeaway points are: listen to your mind and your body, pay attention to the connections between your mind and your body and what's happening with you internally. And really importantly, make self-care a routine. It is not a luxury. It's a requirement for your own survival.
I want to thank you so much. This hour flew by. Dr. Abena, whenever I talk to you, I feel enlightened and educated. You are brilliant at what you do. I know that people have more questions, more comments, and you are open to them contacting you, can you let us know how they can reach you?
Right. So I can be reached on Instagram at safespace_therapy.
And we're going to put that in the comments for everyone.
Awesome. And so every once in a while, I try to make sure I'm posting some information there about self-care or reminders for self-care, little tidbits to maybe help you to think about it a little bit differently and to help you to realize that, again, it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be expensive. It really is how you choose to think about your experience and how you choose to make small everyday steps to take care of yourself.
And I just want to encourage you all too to join our email list for It's Dr. Tara. If you want to leave your email address in the comments or send me an inbox to stay informed of our upcoming events. We have a couple of fun things happening in October. So please feel free to connect with me as well. Dr. Abena, I want to just echo everyone's sentiment. We got comments thanking you and appreciating you being on the show before we even stop. So
thank you for having me.
Speak to
my pleasure.
Everyone, as always, thank you for tuning in to Dr. Tara Tuesdays. As always, let's heal together. I look forward to coming back in next Tuesday at 9 p.m. I have another special guest. So thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye.
Bye.